Have you ever noticed how friends come and go over the course of your life? And of those people you've left behind, how often do you think of someone you knew when you were 10? Or in your teens at school? Once a month? Once a year? Maybe never. One old childhood friend of mine by the name of Karl never really leaves my mind. He's always there in the background, and every other day he's burned into my consciousness with a crystal clear, pinpoint recollection. I met the 14-year-old red-haired, thick-set scruff that was Karl when I was 13, just after my family dragged me to the sticks. Going from the city to Hicksville was an initial shock. Gone were all the amusements of the modern world, but I quickly realized that they were nothing compared to the almost total freedom you had in the country. The downsides were that there were only 3 girls of my age living within a mile radius and only 1 boy, so you made friends quickly out of necessity as well as choice. For the next 2.5 years there weren't many days that our small clan were not hanging out together, and not many nights either, because at 11 p.m. you'd be out of the window, across a roof or down a drain pipe, meeting up for a smoke, sometimes a drink, or maybe riding horses along old haunted lanes in the moonlight. And we were always laughing, always having fun and free of parents who were at best disinterested, and in some cases a little too interested in using their fists or a metal chain to get a point across. We were free in the English countryside, but the English countryside is a strange place. For the most part, country people are some of the best characters you could ever imagine, but then you get odd places, little pockets where you just seem to get a collection of every crank and odd job personality focused in one area, and that coincidentally was where I now lived. Almost every other house either had a tale to tell, or someone lived in it that was a tale waiting to be told. From the guy that would attack you when you went near his fields, maybe with good reason, to the woman who blew raspberries at everybody because she thought we were all aliens, from the house where a guy blew his head off with a shotgun, only being found after his windows went black with flies, to the house where a guy came home and hacked up his wife and kids. Every pile of stone and mortar had its secret. But our little band dodged the bullets, literally on occasion, like the time when a fist-sized chunk of wood flew from the tree right next to one of the girls' heads. And you knew that whoever had fired that bullet that caused it probably had not meant to miss. Or like when we were out selling eggs, and a guy answered our knock at the door by shoving a double-barrel shotgun through the letterbox with the words, "F off or die." As we effed off, we saw his wife tied to a chair, gun at her head. We didn't tell anyone or call the police. We knew he'd almost certainly kill her if we did. But for all that, like I say, life, when we were together, was awesome. In between our wild revelry came school, and on occasion odd jobs for local farmers and anyone who would pay us in drink and cigarettes, in truth. So we'd be baling hay one day, followed by homemade damson wine, and then we'd be laying roof insulation for bottles of beer the next. It was the way out there that the made-up laws of the land didn't really apply. No one saw any problem giving us a drink, and we certainly were not going to complain. Back in the day when many of the old locals started work, they were 9 or 10 years old at the time, and a kid of 13 had to do the same work as a grown man. So they didn't care about the fake laws of people they considered prissy city dwellers. To them, we were adults, albeit small ones, One such old local was Annie. She lived in a ramshackle ruin of a house at the top of the hill, and the very first time I saw her was when her husband was still alive, a week or so after moving in. She strode down the hill, her wild grey hair blowing in the breeze around a face so weathered and creased you'd have thought she was 140, never mind the 60-odd years that people thought she had. She was wearing brown corduroy pants, no doubt her husband's cast-offs, held up with a piece of string, and the man's shirt she sported protruded out of the busted zipper slot in those dirty trousers. She cackled a raucous greeting from a mouth that had but a handful of teeth remaining. "Hey up, young'un," she said. "Have you seen my cows?" Quite an original opening line. Old Annie had known exactly where her cows were. She'd put them in our fields the night before. She knew we were dumb townies, and we might believe that her herd had escaped, walked miles down winding lanes, just to open a gate and put themselves in our untouched grass. But she played us well. A deal to leave her heifers there in exchange for eggs and milk was made, but of course they never appeared, and for an entire year old Annie had free grazing. Eventually Annie's husband died, and she picked him up and carried him 2 miles to a phone box, where she called an ambulance, because although old, Annie was as hard as nails. She looked spindly and some might say frail, but she could have beaten down any man I've ever known. It was not uncommon to see her walking 3 miles or more, carrying 100 pounds of coal. Even in deep snow, nothing fazed old Annie. But it didn't mean that we didn't all feel sorry for her, living up there all alone, except for her 10 dogs, 60 cats, chickens, horses, and cows. And so when Annie wanted some work done, despite her past one-sided exchanges, I was happy to agree. Karl was not so happy. He didn't really trust Annie. He'd been gently conned by her once or twice before, so on the cold October morning we wandered up to her door. He was laying down the law about how she had better pay us and what a dump this place was. And it really was a dump in truth. The old farmhouse Annie lived in was time-worn to the point that a good quarter of the roof had fallen in, and the main entrance was now just a door hanging limply on its hinges. From there, what had been once a great hallway led away across rain-soaked floors into a house that was split into 2 wings. The east wing was where Annie now effectively lived. It comprised a number of ruined rooms, and the kitchen where Annie ate and slept on a mattress on the floor, surrounded by her mastiffs, all her cats, and various smaller dogs she'd acquired, most of which greeted you by foaming at the mouth and raging like they were surveying their next doggy dinner. Many's the time we thought they'd have us for that dinner, when the windows to that room would rattle and buckle under the weight of the furry host within, fighting to get at us. The west wing was somewhat less decrepit. It had numerous bedrooms, a sitting room, dining room, and other spaces that had once had some implied use that various pieces of ruined furniture hinted at. We knocked at her door that chill morning, and out Annie came. Fighting back the drooling frenzy within, she greeted us with her usual shrill caterwailing, and soon we were wandering out into the fields, being shown to some 40 new fence posts and barbed wire that she needed putting up. The work was, of course, in no way beyond Annie, a fact she reminded us of as we set about the task, where she said in her own words, "I just like giving you youngsters some proper man's work to do," the sarcasm in her voice barely concealed. And then she wandered back down the hill, saying she would pay us when she got back, as she had to go out for a few hours. Karl's ears picked up at this news. He wasn't a rogue by any means, and it wasn't like he'd ever stolen anything as such, but that didn't mean he didn't want to know what old Annie had stashed away, just for the sake of curiosity, I imagined. And as we watched her striding away down the lane, Karl was primed and ready to go for a snoop. I wasn't mad keen on the idea, not least because of the risk of the guardians in the kitchen, or of an early return by Annie. But curiosity got the better of me, and I tagged along for the sake of being nosy. The east wing was out of bounds, but as we went through the downstairs rooms in the west wing, it became ever more apparent just how odd Annie was. The first room, the dining room, had the remnants of a dead foal in it. All that was left was the head and part of the spinal cord. The rest had no doubt gone for pet food. We both knew Annie loved her horses. In fact, we knew she loved all her pets. But even so, it was still disturbing to see the ruthless practicality with which that pet had been recycled. From there we went into what must have been the library at some time. But the books were gone, no doubt sold, and just shelves remained, dotted with bits of wood and stone that must have caught Annie's eye at some time as suitable impromptu ornaments. Then another room, the main feature of which was a writing table covered in junk and papers, but which was clearly still in use due to the final demand for her electricity and some bank statements that really did show that Annie was either impoverished or was hiding her cash in the attic, a clue that spurred Karl on to search upstairs, but not before he'd pulled out all the drawers on that desk to find nothing of interest except 4 empty wallets and what looked to be 2 gold teeth. The bedrooms were just as intriguing. Clearly all but one hadn't been used for a long time. No doubt that most recently occupied room had been vacated when Annie's husband died, and it was littered with the tattered rags that passed as Annie's clothes. From there things got worse. Spooky was not really the word, for the creaking doors that led to dust-covered beds and windows blackened with mould and filth. The final room had a dead cat curled up in the middle of the bed, mummified, and this tipped my balance of curiosity in favour of going back to our intended job, and I left Karl to his attempt to get into the loft. But not 10 minutes had passed when he too wandered back up the field, complaining loudly about it being a creepy old rat hole. A few hours passed, and the cold morning transformed itself into a cold afternoon, when the dog chorus announced the return of our employer. But it was half an hour later before she finally sauntered up to see how the work was going. Only 2 posts remained, and Annie was making statements of wild appreciation as only she could, saying what a good job we'd done and how we deserve a proper reward. As she walked away to get our pay, I could see Karl's face, all smiles and beaming, as he chittered about how it would most likely be cash, given how pleased she was. Annie returned a few minutes later, meeting us as we made our way back down the field, the job now complete. "Here you are, boys," she said, holding out her hand, as if containing coins or notes ready to drop. Karl rushed forward, his dirty fingers eager to grab the prize. "You deserve this. You've worked very hard," Annie said as she dropped the reward. Karl stared in horror at what lay in his palm, because there, glinting in the midday sun, was a shiny, small apple and 10 hazelnuts, the same almost instantly being thrust out to my hand, as Annie, her face racked in a pained expression that didn't match her words, then turned and strode off, no doubt trying to avoid the angry storm that her cheap payoff might elicit. And that was probably a good call, because as she disappeared back into her den, Karl was fuming. "What's this shit?" he said. 4 hours of work for a poxy apple and a few nuts. Is she joking? And he then proceeded to call her every name under the sun, and to say that one way or another he was going to get paid. I was at first overcome with similar deep disappointment myself. But then it occurred to me that 100 years before it might not have been uncommon to be paid such a paltry sum, and by such means. And although Annie knew she had tricked us, I couldn't help feel like it was a living history lesson, if only in why you shouldn't ever do a job without knowing what you'll be paid. Karl was having none of it, though. He stormed off after Annie while I went back for the tools and unused wire that were left behind. It wasn't long before Karl's voice carried over that meadow, screeching at Annie about what a bitch she was and how she'd either pay us or he'd be taking payment himself. Annie complained that she had no money to spare, and that times were hard since her husband had died. But Karl was in full flow, and I decided to delay my return until peace resumed. The row rumbled on a few more minutes until, in a hail of derisive words, Karl crossed Annie's yard and took his anger out on one of her cats, kicking it clear over a wall as he walked away towards the lane. The last thing I saw of the exchange was Annie running after Karl, wailing that he shouldn't have done that and that she'd finally pay him. I guess because although she'd have brazened out her small con, she didn't want her precious pets being hurt, and she and Karl duly disappeared into her dwelling. I wasn't keen to join the exchange. Regardless of Annie's methods, I knew she was a master of the double deal before I did the work, and whilst I could sort of understand Karl being angry, he'd crossed the line by kicking her cat. So for now I just wanted to stay out of it, and resisting the urge to simply walk off and leave them to it, I sat and had a smoke instead. By the time I eventually got down to the farmhouse, Annie was stood in the entrance looking kind of sheepish, and Karl was nowhere to be seen. "He's left you to it," Annie muttered as I approached. "He's a temper on that one, hasn't he?" she continued, as she surveyed me with one eye open and the other half closed. "You don't have to give me anything," I said in an apologetic tone, half meaning it and half hoping she'd insist anyway. But instead she just smiled and came back with the excuse that she'd given Karl her only spare cash before he stormed off, and how he can't be much of a friend, as he'd gone off to spend it without me. I nodded meaninglessly, and then Annie inquired if I could do one more small job for her before I left. An old wall on a nearby horse paddock needed rebuilding. I wasn't keen to repeat the process, not exactly being a fan of either apples or hazelnuts, but at the same time I still weirdly felt guilty about what had just taken place. So I agreed to do it, for nothing as a favour, and duly set about the job in what was now a drizzly, dull afternoon. An hour and a half later the work was over, and I returned to let Annie know I was going. She was her usual wails of appreciation, but also insistent that she felt so guilty at not being able to pay me that I must stay for a meal she'd made to say thank you. I really didn't want to take her up on the offer, but I've always had difficulty with the word no, and with causing deliberate offence. So I tried a few half-hearted throw-offs, falsely stating that there would be something waiting for me at home, but the look of disappointment on Annie's face made it impossible to get out of it, and I knew that I had no choice but to agree. So she ushered me into the room that had been storing the horse's head, except now it was gone. and the long wooden table that resided there had been laid for dinner, while a roaring fire warmed the place. Annie scuttered off, and I sat at the head seat on a damp and mouldy ornate chair, and waited for her return while wondering just what delights could ever come from that pungent kennel that passed as her kitchen and bedroom. As the light outside faded, I listened to the crackling fire and every creak and groan coming from that ruinous house, and I wondered if just sneaking away into the night could ever be excused. But at the point where I was seriously about to make a break for it, Annie returned with 2 slightly clouded wine glasses and a bottle of old port. "Little Karl shouldn't have been so impatient, should he?" she said, as she plonked them down, and half-filled each from a bottle that looked like it hadn't seen the light of day for decades. I agreed with her statement, despite shuddering at the raw taste of the liquid refreshment. It was alcohol, and all alcohol was good in my book. Annie then disappeared again, and my head was quickly swimming as the drink took hold on an empty stomach. By the time she returned, I was already starting to see the funny side of the whole situation, thanks to the booze. She put down 2 plates and some cutlery, poured us both another drink, and told me that our dinner was nearly ready. I have to say my trepidation about hygiene issues had waned a little as the smell of cooking wafted in. I was famished. An apple and a few nuts weren't much to stave off the hunger that comes from a full day working in the cold, and I really wanted her to hurry up and serve whatever was making that aroma. I took another gulp of port, not really a drink for gulping, but until the food arrived, drink was going to have to do to fill my stomach. When Annie finally emerged again from her lair, bearing delights, I was just starting to sway and giggle to myself about random amusements, like how she had a pair of boots hanging from the wooden chandelier, and how the room was slowly filling with cats. 1 had jumped onto my lap, 2 were on the table, and of the other 5 seats available, 4 had regal moggies sitting on them, almost as if they were fellow guests. The feast arrived on a large, somewhat dishevelled silver platter that clearly showed that old Annie was keeping all her precious possessions in that stinking hovel she lived in. She thudded it down on the table, as if it weighed far more than it did, and as she grabbed the lid and lifted it, she announced its arrival with the words, "Proper food for you there, lad," followed by a long and shrill laugh. I eyed the steaming wonder before me, musing about just how stupid Karl had been. For there, laid out on that great plate, was an enormous hunk of meat on the bone, surrounded by potatoes and carrots, swimming in a thick gravy. Drunk and ravenous, it was the best thing I'd ever seen at that very moment, as Annie grabbed the carving knife and began slicing huge chunks off, skewering them and dropping them on my plate. Then came the veg and gravy and another top-up of my glass. Then, while Annie watched, seemingly waiting for my approval, I cut a piece of meat, slathered it in gravy, and dined. I couldn't hide the fact that it was delicious, done to perfection. Whatever else Annie was, she was a good cook. She smiled as I told her how amazing it tasted. It was the best I'd ever had, I told her, as I demolished the pile of food before me. Annie then joined in. For a thin woman, she had an appetite. In fact, before I'd even finished, she'd emptied her plate and was cutting some more, and not just for her, but little plates she had brought with her were now being filled with cat-sized slivers. and after my plate was reloaded, our odd entourage joined in the feasting, as Annie began to regale me with lurid tales about various locals. Drink and more drink flowed. We ate half the roast and all the potatoes and carrots. Then we just gorged on what was left. Meat and drink. Meat and drink. The hours passed, and the stories and scandals flowed from Annie's mouth as we laughed the evening away. By 11 o'clock the fire was burning down, along with the candles, and as I chewed the last succulent shreds of meat from that bone, Annie asked if I had to go, as my parents might be worried, the hour being so late. I told her they wouldn't, and that it wasn't uncommon for them to lock me out anyway, so a night in a freezing hayloft probably lay ahead. She said I could stay in one of the old rooms upstairs if I liked, but knowing what lay up there, I knew that was a delight I'd rather avoid. So I thanked her, and with a slurred exchange of farewells I stumbled and staggered my way from her house, off into the darkness, hoping that, drunk as I was, I'd be able to find my way home, and avoid having to sleep in a field as I'd done a few times before, although never in autumn. I did spend that night in the barn, locked out as I expected, drunk enough to ignore the army of spiders that no doubt crawled over me in the night. The next day was a Sunday, and it passed in a hangover, parents grunting at me as I inconveniently returned to prove that -5°C wasn't quite enough to finish me off. The only odd thing that day was that Karl didn't turn up, as he always did, and that night I wandered over to his place, only to find it in darkness. His mother was always out playing bridge on a Sunday night, and normally Karl would be left in babysitting his 2 younger brothers, but there were no lights on. A few days passed, and Karl's mother called in and asked me if I'd seen her son, a question loaded with insults about what a worthless kid he was, and how he was just like his useless father. When I said I hadn't seen him since Saturday, she just shrugged her shoulders and said, "He's pissed off again, hopefully for good." I wondered whether she meant it. I wasn't sure if it was some coping mechanism she was throwing out at me. I do know she informed the police that he'd gone missing, but they never asked any questions, and he was logged as a runaway. Years then passed. I grew up, met someone, and moved away, but I did keep contact with the girls for a while, and with some of the other people that moved in after that time. But I never had a friend like Karl again. For his faults, he was a loyal, beleaguered soul, just trying to get through childhood, while dealing with a drunken mother, a violent, mostly absent father, and the occasional gangs singling him out for a battering at the school he was forced to go to. The memory of Karl, and all the others, started to fade, and 12 years later I heard that old Annie had died, an event I couldn't quite visualize. She was just so tough. I was told they came for her cats, killed most of them that were too old or too scratty to be rehomed, all on the premise of being compassionate. The irony of it. And that was that, or at least I thought it was, until I chanced on a small headline 2 years later. It was above a picture of old Annie's farm, and the caption read, "House of Horrors Discovered." I immediately assumed this must have been concerning something that happened before Annie had lived there, but as I read on I discovered that her house had been bought by a city type who was renovating it. You know the sort. He wanted a pristine country show home to exhibit what a wealthy, vacuous bore he was. And as he had had the old stone slabs at the back of the house ripped up, the workmen found human remains, parts of skulls, and various gnawed bones. The article mentioned Annie, and how some of the 10 remains found so far were recent. 6, it said, had been identified. As my eyes scanned those names, I saw one of Annie's near neighbours mentioned, a man by the name of Gregson. He was known to hate Annie's cats, and had put down poison for them, it was rumoured, an evil act he carried out just before he went missing. And then I saw a Miss Mackenzie. She was a care worker that had been assigned to poke her nose into Annie's affairs when Annie had a fall and broke her leg 1 year. Annie had mentioned her over dinner that night, as we had our feast. She said some nasty little rat from the council wanted to take her pets away, and to put her into one of those pseudo-prisons for the elderly. She didn't elaborate on why, but she said she'd not be coming round here no more. A few names followed that I'd not heard of before. One, a known thief, and another a woman who was, according to the article, a hill walker and a campaigner for the neutering of feral cats. I couldn't help but have a small laugh to myself on seeing that, despite the dread contents of the article. Annie was not one to be bullied by a passing busybody, I thought to myself. Then my eyes fell on a name I knew only too well, that I couldn't believe, didn't want to believe was there before me. It said Karl Richards, describing him as a young tearaway thought to have left home 1 October 14 years previously. I stared at his name in disbelief as the meaning of it all slowly unfurled in my mind. Annie had killed Karl, I first thought. She must have killed him that day. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it was a moment of madness, and she fed him to the dogs to cover it up. Maybe he tried to steal from her, and she finished him off and buried him in lime, and his skull was all that was left behind, I told myself. Then my eyes caught another line, and it said that some bones found had cut marks on them, and that they had been cooked. And I had no choice but to think the unthinkable, an unspeakable truth that burst into my mind like some oozing, infected, pus-filled sore that discharged its rancid contents into the fabric of my brain, forever contaminating it. That Annie's feast, that succulent roast, that unspecified platter of meat, was none other than Karl. And I was sick, vomiting for hours, and then days, unable to eat, unable to think of anything but that fatty gravy, those meat juices squishing into my mouth, that flesh tearing between my teeth as I'd eaten that meat of horrors, a meal of meat that in my drunken state I'd not even bothered to identify, but I now knew exactly what it was, a human thigh bone. And I can't escape that awful memory. No day goes by that I don't see meat in some shop, or see someone eating it, or smell the vile aroma of it cooking. And then I can hear Karl's voice, hear him shouting at Annie that day, and see her face grinning ghoulishly as she waited for me to taste my own oblivion from that rank platter. I try to bury the memory, to hide it from the world and myself in the darkest recesses of my mind, but it's always there. I want to, but even now I can't hate Annie for damning my sanity, for butchering Karl and serving him up. She's always there, cackling inside my skull, you see, like it was all some amusing jest, a dark prank. Her last words to me that fateful evening, forever fused in some drunken corner of my brain. "He thought he was tough, your little friend, didn't he?" she said, as I'd staggered away from her that night. Turned out he wasn't. Turned out he was quite tender. And I laughed at a joke that I didn't understand as I fell away into the darkness. We both laughed together.